back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride.
And welcome back to The Law Show on CL 650. We're talking about immigration, citizenship. We're talking a lot about the Trump administration bringing in the executive order and the ripple effects it's had from the banning of these 7 different countries. But we're also going to talk a little bit about Canada-U.S. relations, what's on the radar, and how it affects the flow of people back and forth across the country. So in Canada, we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, Canada, United States, Mexico. There's talk of that being revisited. And what effect is that having on your line of work with it when it comes to immigration?
Well, I mean, we're having people that are concerned whether the agreement's going to be in place, although, I mean, there hasn't been any move to tear it up. There's talk about that. So people that are here on work permits that were issued under NAFTA are concerned, will they be allowed to continue to stay?
But you have explained to me in the past that people at a certain level are quite easily, they're easy to move back and forth across the border because of NAFTA.
Yeah.
So explain what the rules are now.
So right now under NAFTA, there's about between 40 and 60 sort of professionals that are on a list. So and if you meet the definition of this professional, for example, if you're an engineer, you've got an engineering degree, you've worked as an engineer, you're coming up to do engineering work, and you have a job offer in Canada, you can be processed at the border fairly quickly. Right? And it allows you to come in and work without sort of having to prove that there's any labor shortage. And it's the same in reverse, right? So if a Canadian, gets a job offer in the States and they're an engineer or they're a lawyer or they're a nurse, generally they're able to go down to the United States with a straightforward application, the job offer, pay some fees. But if they've got those qualifications, there's no need to go almost through a labor shortage process where you've sort of got to vet and say, we've got to prove again and again that we need these people. So that they've been exempt because it's felt that it increases trade, right? And that these people aren't in shortage. So there's an advantage to them coming down. And that's the way the system's been working up until now.
So if the Trump administration decides to withdraw from NAFTA, would we revert back to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement?
But so my understanding is yes, although my understanding of what's happening behind the scenes is there's talk between all 3 countries on renegotiating the parts of NAFTA that the U.S. administration seems to have issues with.
And that's a border adjustment tax is what they want to implement.
Well, that's what they're publicly saying, but I mean, there's a number of agenda items that would be probably beneficial for Canada to review. For example, I mean, right now, softwood lumber isn't covered under NAFTA. And yet that's a major BC export and something that
why wasn't that included?
Well, because the U.S. lobby, the lumber lobby in the United States, didn't allow it to be.
Because they thought that the crown stumpage fee was an advantage for.
Well, they see it as a subsidy. I mean, and that remains a constant thorn on the trade front. We've had NAFTA since 1992, Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement since 89. It's never covered softwood lumber. That's always had to be in a separate agreement.
And then you've got things like dairy farmers and the quotas and all of those things too, right?
Sure. And the challenge that we have now is with NAFTA being openly talked about being revisited, we have the implementation of the Canada-European Union Free Trade Agreement, which is supposed to take effect next year. We have the ongoing uncertainty around that because of Brexit and because was this something we seriously would have negotiated if the UK was not going to be part of it?
I heard that a lot of the Canadians that have been sort of spearheading these free trade negotiations, either between Canada and Europe or Canada and Korea or TPP, are now being scooped up and being brought to the UK to help them form free trade agreements with, say, the United States and Canada independently.
Yeah, well, those are some of the challenges that they're going to have due to the political decisions they've made. I mean, from the Canadian perspective, what's been enormously disruptive because of the decisions the United States have made is uncertainty around Canada-U.S. information sharing and Canada-U.S. border controls. In our previous segment, my illustrious colleague here was talking about electronic travel authorizations. We implemented that as part of an agreement with the United States because they have something like that already called ESTA.
Well, let me just ask that a broad question. How integrated are the two countries when it comes to immigration and the movement of people? Like,
well, we've been integrating more and more. That's been the trend.
I think far less than people realize, though. I mean, when somebody shows up at the border, a question asked by a lot of our clients is, well, they must know when I leave, right? So the government, when I apply you have to apply for every 5 years. People that are permanent resident, they have a card that they have to apply for every 5 years. Or when people are ready to apply for citizenship, they have to fill out a form. And it's assumed by, I would say, almost half of our clients that come in, well, the government must have these records of how long I've been here. The reality is we don't. We don't have any exit controls in Canada. So we don't know when you leave. But we are sharing now with the United States information as to when people enter. So when Americans and other foreign nationals enter Canada, we're sharing that information. And
vice versa when I go down to the U.S.
So the U.S. is now sharing that information with us, which we didn't have before. So it's available, but it's in a separate database.
Isn't that an important thing to know when people are leaving the country? Because as we've talked in previous shows, you have to have a certain requirement of time spent in Canada in order to qualify to be a citizen. But there's really, it's no way to prove it that you left.
Well, I mean, there are other ways to prove it. It's just, what you're talking about is the facility of a database versus looking at passport stamps. How this used to be done is you would simply look at passport stamps. Yeah. The challenge now, of course, is that with
electronic passports
and biometric passports,
not a lot of people get stamps anymore, right? So you're going into the country, and often your country of citizenship doesn't stamp you when you come in. Right? Mm-hmm. You're just allowed entry. I think, it's a good question. I mean, as a free country, the question is, if we're allowing people, we don't control people leaving because you're only here if you want to be here. And the thought that we're actually going to control who's allowed to leave, I think is something that we've never done. But I think it's now becoming, given the changes in technology, a lot easier to do. Yeah. And I think we're going to see that. Now, actually, we promised to roll it out this summer, right?
Because I'm a Nexus card holder, and I do punch in and punch out when I go across the border. I go through the Nexus process when I leave Canada and when I come back in. So they obviously have a record of me because I'm a Nexus.
Well, actually, they don't.
They don't keep that?
No, because what you're talking about is entry and exit to the U.S. If you went to the U.S. and then flew to Mexico, went to 10 other countries,
right,
and then came back to Canada, we wouldn't know that you didn't go to 10 other countries.
Right. They do know when I left and entered the country, though.
No, they know when you entered. They don't know when you left. It's just that the Nexus keeps track of that on the U.S. side so that you have access to this if you make a special request to get both sets of information. But that isn't an exit control. That's just a feature of the Nexus system, Zach. What the problem with the U.S. administration and the uncertainty around what these policies and their constitutionality, particularly of the most recent executive orders, is that we have agreements with the United States that have real implementation consequences. When the United States negotiated them with the Trudeau administration, and prior to that, with the Harper government, we were expected to roll out exit controls, and the expectation was this summer would be our exit control time. Now, that rollout was done with considerable reluctance by the Canadian authorities because we don't have a history. We're not a police state. We don't keep track of when people leave, especially our own citizens.
People are always shocked that they don't have a requirement to have a permanent resident card, right? And a lot of, in most European countries, you need to have an identification card.
Absolutely.
And there were some people that were pushing that the PR card should be mandatory, that you actually have to have one all the time. And the argument against that from civil libertarians is we're not a police state. Why should you have to have identification on you all the time to show who you are?
But the challenge here is if we're going to roll out these exit controls, you have an agreement where we were sharing information with a state that we largely had the same interests as, that all of a sudden we may not have always the same interest.
It's had a dramatic shift, yeah.
And, the challenge that poses, we're not implementing these exit controls much like we only implemented ETA for domestic reasons. We did it for strategic reasons to integrate our system as part of a North American strategy. Well, wait a minute. All of a sudden, that North American strategy seems somewhat arbitrary and seems subject to the whims of one man's Twitter account. Nobody actually signed up for that when these agreements were negotiated. And in addition to that, the carrot for Canada has always been we implement security protocols And what we get back for that is more integration in terms of trade. Well, they just signed an agreement 2 months before the president took office to allow for pre-screening of goods at Canadian at Canadian manufacturing sites. Where is that going now that there's renegotiation of NAFTA? So there's an enormous amount of uncertainty.
So you're saying there was a tit for tat here. We'll give you this if you agree to make things easier.
Correct.
But now you're not doing that, so why should we implement
Well, and now there's a push maybe, that they're going to start looking for biometrics from Canadians, right? If they go to a biometric requirement.
I just want to get back to your point earlier, is that everybody asks, don't they know when I leave? I go down to Point Roberts to buy gas, or go to Blaine to buy gas, and I exit through the U.S. side, and I get gas, and I come back. You kind of think that they know, well, that guy left 10 minutes ago, and now he's back at the Canadian border.
You're asking two questions when you ask that, Zach. You're asking two questions. The first question you're asking is, do they know right away that how long I've been gone? Which is a separate question. And can they find out how long I've been gone away? So to answer your second question, I think, yes, it isn't as anywhere near as difficult as it used to be for them to gather that information. But do they know it right when you cross?
Well,
they certainly don't know.
Well, that's the thing. I think a lot of people might be surprised, and they think, okay, it comes up on my screen. He's driving a red Buick, and he's going down to buy gas, and then he comes across. Oh, there's that red Buick again. That's what. I think.
Entering the States, and depending at Point Roberts, I don't think they have the facility, but at Peace Arch, they photograph your passport.
Yes, they do.
In, right?
Yeah, they do in Point Roberts as well. But I'm just saying, as a layperson, that's what I assume. They know. Oh, this he's only been gone 15 minutes.
Well, you got to remember the purposes of primary and secondary in both systems are very different. So when you cross into primary, the person, especially if you're not in a nexus situation, they have to ascertain in a very short period of time, because they want to keep the flow of people going, what your purpose of entry is. And that transaction is designed, and they're trained to keep it to 90 seconds or less on both sides of the border. So if there's an issue that arises, it has to be flagged on your passport, or has to be something that you say, because the officer doesn't have access to all of their databases in an unlimited amount of real time.
Right.
Right there. They only have limited ones.
It's the same thing with a criminal record. So clients call us and say, I'm a little bit worried. I've got a criminal record. And, you start talking to them, you realize they've been coming across the border a lot, and they're kind of shocked that they're not getting caught every time and being stopped and asked about their criminal record. Is because the officer at the border in real time can't sort of look and say, you have access to the FBI database through CPIC, which they have, and they can eventually have, but it takes time to get into that download.
We're all watching TV too much, and we see these crime shows where they see everything in real time.
But that doesn't mean it won't happen one day.
Yeah.
The reality is, what happens now is you're sent from primary to secondary, and in secondary, where
you can do a lengthy,
where 10 minutes is a normal transaction time, now in 10 minutes you can find out all kinds of things about people. And I mean, that would be true of somebody having the time to do a Google search if they want.
Yes.
So there's a lot more information readily available to them if you're sent to secondary.
And what happens when you're flying in, sometimes they'll do random checks of passengers on the plane. So all of a sudden, a person's been flying in a lot without any issue and has some sort of issue in their past. Maybe it's criminal. Maybe it's a problem with Canadian Border Services before. And all of a sudden they get flagged and they think it's something they said. It has nothing to do with that. They've sort of done a random selection of people on that plane because they get the manifest ahead of time, and they've run a check to see.
Well, and that's not even the whole story.
I'll tell you what, hang on, because we're a little over time. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to continue our conversation with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law about immigration, citizenship, border issues next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.